Or wherever you are, it's a good day. I'm Kate Trinka. I'm the lead ambassador of the environment sector for the Charter for Compassion and the coordinator of this Global READ program. Welcome. Be sure that if you like this program to donate to the Charter. We would really appreciate that. Also, please mark your calendars for our next Global READ with Benjamin Science, who will be discussing his book, Aristotle and Dante, Discover the Secrets of the Universe. It's a wonderful young adult fiction novel that you're sure to enjoy. November 13th is the date, 7 a.m. Pacific time. We would appreciate it if you'd let your local schools know about it so we could get some students involved in the live webinar. Then in December, we're delighted to have with us senior writer of Drawdown. The Drawdown is the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. We have senior writer Catherine Wilkinson with us. But finally, I'm pretty sure that you're here to meet and speak with, hopefully, Mrs. Mary Robinson, who wrote the book Climate Justice. And we'll be introducing her in a brief moment. But first, I also want to introduce to you another special guest that we have with us, Mark Barish. He is the founder of the Green World Campaign. He's the author of several books, one of which we have featured here on our Global READ program. It's called Compassionate Life. He is a film and television writer, producer, magazine editor, and environmental activist. He has been an editor-in-chief of New Age Journal and editor of Psychology Today and Natural Health. The Green World Campaign is a nonprofit whose mission is restoring the ecology and economy of struggling villages living on degraded land. Thanks, Mark, for being here with us and helping discuss this very engaging book with our honored guest. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for, I'd like to introduce, I have the amazing honor and distinct privilege to introduce Mrs. Mary Robinson, who served as the 7th President of Ireland, becoming the first woman to hold this office. She also serves as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Mrs. Robinson set up the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice, which aims to be a center for thought leadership, education, and advocacy on the struggle to secure global justice for those many victims of climate change who are usually forgotten, the poor, the disempowered, and the marginalized across the world. She's currently chair of the Elders, founded by Nelson Mandela. The Elders is an independent group of global leaders working together for peace, justice, and human rights. She is a passionate force for gender equality, women's participation in peace building, human rights and dignity, and of course, the environment. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to do one more thing before I let you two have this amazing dialogue. I want to welcome everyone who's here with us this morning. And at the bottom of your screen, there is a little bubble icon, which is called the chat room. If you want to send any messages or questions to either Mark or Mary Robinson for our show today, then please type those in there and we'll be giving those to them later in this program. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Mrs. Robinson, for being here. Mark, you can take it from here, please.
So, Mary, first of all, thank you for your lifetime of work on behalf of People and Planet, and for this new expansion of the same ethos of peace to making peace with the planet itself and with all beings that are trying to jostle to live here together and get through what really we all know is an evolutionary bottleneck. I just wanted to say as a preface, we have in common Wangari Maathai, who I also worked with in the early 90s and who got me really simply by her moral presence, I think, into this idea of regreening the world and using tree planting as a medium for transformation of societies as well as ourselves.
Wangari was such a wonderful woman. I actually asked her to be on the board of my foundation, which I was establishing in 2010. And that's when she told me the bad news that she had a serious illness which was going to, unfortunately, end her life far too early. But she was just a great mentor and And I learned so much from her.
So I met her in the context of, at the time I was doing a film for Ted Turner that was a global broadcast for the Earth Summit in Rio, which you'll remember well. It was a time of tremendous hope. And actually we did a show that featured children who were asking the adults to kindly preserve their planet for them and not destroy it. And the children expressed hope and despair and moral outrage. And we had them say that the causes of the ice caps melting, which we sort of heralded, was carbon, cash, cows, and cars. And it was eerily familiar to me to be in New York this last week and see the extraordinary moment, historic moment, I think, of moral outrage of Greta Thunberg before the UN. And yet I also remember how we received millions of postcards, and it was in general a moment of great hope. And then here we are, 30 years later, nearly, and we are in a deep crisis. And I wonder what it is that gives you the most hope, especially looking at these millions of children. And what do you think the way forward is going to be from here on? Have people finally awakened? Is this going to be another movement that doesn't have a place to go, in a sense?
Yes, these are very, very good questions. First of all, what gives me hope is the determination of people to cope with what they are not responsible for. When I wrote this book about climate justice, the byline was hope, resilience, and the fight for a sustainable future. And the stories are all about those who are least responsible but most affected, which is the injustice of climate change. But now the school children have reminded us of the intergenerational injustice, which you were encouraging them to do at a much earlier stage. And we have the frameworks to go forward. I mean, we have the 2030 agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals, and we have the Paris Climate Agreement. And now we're at the stage where it's not about talk, it's not about promises, it's about actual implementation. And because I was there in Paris and there in September of 2015 as the special envoy of the Secretary General on climate change, I like to remind people that, you know, it was quite extraordinary that 193 countries in September could agree the 2030 agenda. But I think they did it because it was voluntary. They considered that it was voluntary. And then when we moved to the Paris Climate Agreement in December 2015, it was a treaty, but it got weaker and weaker, except for one thing, and that was the pressure and the advocacy of the small island states, of the least developed countries, of the indigenous peoples, of civil society walking in the street in Paris saying 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5 to stay alive, meaning that we had to have a new goal, which we got, of staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degrees. And the scientists had never studied that, as you know. And therefore, when they were asked to and gave the report last October, they made it clear that there's a big difference between staying at 1.5 degrees and going up to 2 degrees, that quite bad things happen. The coral reefs disappear probably, the Arctic ice melts completely, and the permafrost, which is already melting, melts even more and throws up methane as well as carbon. And therefore we need to stay at 1.5 degrees, and then we need to reduce our carbon by 45% by 2030. And that was the message they had. You have 12 years, which is what started this Fridays for Future of children nowadays. And what they said, what the scientists actually said was that it was doable if we had the political will. And that's what is so important now.
Yes. Now, to be provocative for a moment, we're at almost 1 degree, and we're seeing extraordinary climate chaos. I happen to be in New York, in Europe this summer as well as New York, but you know, we hit 115 degrees in southern France. You have wildfires in the Arctic Circle, and indeed all over the world. You have a lot of feedback loops that are beginning to happen. So the wildfires deposit soot on the Arctic ice, that speeds melting. The melting opens up the thermal mass of the ocean, which is dark and absorbs more heat and has less albedo reflecting into space, methane, of course, coming from permafrost. And we are seeing an acceleration at merely 1 degree that makes a lot of people wonder what 1.5 is going to look like, and if that's even a realistic target. And if 10 years is realistic, I hear more in scientific circles, at least they might be outliers, or they might be increasingly not, more like 5 years to begin to, this process that the IPCC says is change at a scale and speed unprecedented in history. I wonder, provocatively, is sustainability enough? I hear a lot more these days about regeneration, that we have to overshoot, and that in a sense, we've been comforting ourselves that there could be business as usual plus, or a sustainable world. It's sort of like, does anybody want a sustainable marriage? No, we want thriving. And I think in a way, these children have said, this is not enough. The moment has come, and we actually have to do a lot more, maybe go beyond what we think we could do.
Well, I definitely agree that the situation is very urgent. I agree absolutely with the children on that, and Greta, but we will, I think, certainly need carbon capture on a much larger scale than we've had. We will need restorative measures. We need the drawdown project to be fully implemented as much as possible. But what I like to kind of say to audiences is, in fact, everyone in the world now needs to take 3 steps. And the first step is to make the climate crisis, and I call it a climate crisis, real in your life, and to do something about your own carbon footprint. Meaning, recycle more carefully, whatever, the things that Wangari Maathai was saying so long ago. Or, I've become a pescatarian, I give that example, I've given up meat. But everybody should do something, not least because we need to own the problem. We need to personally take charge of owning it. And having done that first step, then we have to get angry and get active. Get angry about those with more responsibility who are not taking it. And that is the governments who now have to start increasing their ambition in their commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement and start really implementing. And it's not just governments, it's also cities and towns, it's business, especially fossil fuel, agribusiness, tourism, etc., and transport. And then we have to get active in supporting those who are on the right side of this with conservation, with advocacy about clean energy, etc. And the third step is very important in my view, and that is we have to imagine this world that we want to rush towards. Because if we don't imagine it, we're not going to have the sense of this is worth doing. And I keep emphasizing it's going to be a much healthier world. It's going to be a world that's free of fossil fuel, so free of the fumes and the pollution of air and water that people are dying in their millions from at the moment. It's going to be a much fairer world because we'll have had to implement the 2030 agenda with all its solidarity and leave no one behind. And therefore, we're at that kind of moment before 2020, when in 2020, we have to see governments take these steps.
Yes, and are there certain things that you think are the what Buckminster Fuller called the trim tabs, the leverage points that are most likely to lead to this rapid transformation that we know now is imperative?
I think the real leverage point for me is that countries and companies and organizations would commit to being carbon neutral by 2050 and then work backwards. I'm glad to say that there is that coalition on carbon neutrality with about something like 22 countries, I think now. Ireland, I'm persuading that we are going to join that coalition. And that's the first step, to make that commitment to be carbon neutral, and then know where you're going to be in 2030, know where you're going to be in 2020. All of those commitments have to be much, much stronger. A lot of cities have committed. Businesses, I am very supportive of the B team of business leaders, the Paul Polmans, the Richard Bransons, and others who have stepped up to say that they will be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and do it the climate justice way with just transition, because we have to make sure that it's not done over the back of coal workers initially and then oil and gas workers, that they must be part of the solution.
Yes. And do you think that this calls for transformations of the economic system? I know that Paul Polman, that you cite, certainly gets it. I mean, I've seen him speak, and yet he's at the head of a multinational corporation that has still has to make a profit and has shareholders.
He's no longer head of Unilever.
Yes, exactly. So, but I think honestly, he was probably a little frustrated at the what it takes to turn around the Titanic, as people sometimes refer to it. And obviously, the pace of change, which is what we're talking about here, has to greatly accelerate. What do you think the large corporations can do to sort of up the ante? Is that call for, as some of our presidential candidates here are saying, a really a transformation of the economic system? We live in an extractive system, yes?
More and more people see that that is the reality, because we cannot continue to extract from Mother Earth and consume, produce, consume to run our economies in the way we're doing in a throwaway society. I mean, even when I was growing up, I'm an elder, I'm chair of the elders, and when I was growing up, we learned to darn, to sew on buttons. My four brothers had hand-me-down clothes. We used milk jugs, milk bottles that were recyclable. We need to get back to good habits of slow fashion, slow food, recycling, a circular economy, gradually change behavior to recognize that we need to get rid of plastic, except for some uses in medicine that are vital, but basically try to get rid of it across the board, and certainly get rid of it in wrapping food, etc. And all of this has to happen quickly. So we need the mixture of the private sector. We also need a broad alliance of people holding governments to account. When I went to climate summits, what occurred to me was the only heads of state at conferences in the post-Copenhagen, before Paris, were the presidents of small island states and of very poor countries, because they saw the impact of climate change and they were very worried about what was happening. Most people didn't know that their ministers of environment or their ministers of energy or even their heads of state were going to these conferences. It was just something that was happening without people realizing. And people still don't pay enough attention to the commitments that were made under the 2030 agenda. Governments report to the high-level political forum in July. Nobody knows they're doing it. It's a small, intimate, knowledgeable circle, whereas the whole world needs to be aware from now on of the commitments governments have made, of the reporting they're doing, and in particular of the fact that they have to increase their ambition in 2020 under the 2030, under the Paris Climate Agreement. So, we have the need for the broadest alliance, and it's beginning to emerge with school children, young people, Extinction Rebellion, women leaders. Women leaders have really stepped up. That pleases me more than anything, because it wasn't happening, especially in Europe and the United States. It is now happening. Business, investment, philanthropy, the trade unions, faith leaders, all of us have to form somehow much more pressure on governments bottom up. The investment has to do it top down, to say to companies, you are now at risk of the fact that what you're investing in will become stranded assets, basically. And that's a pressure that people like Mark Carney have been increasingly putting on, and that's also very important.
Yes, I think there's an economist at Stanford who is estimating, simply through market forces of the price of renewables falling, there could be, in electric cars, I think he factors in, there could be a $20 to $30 trillion stranded assets hole in the global economy in just 10 years. The housing crisis, the mortgage crisis was only, I think, about $3 trillion. So we can only imagine what could happen in this economic transition. That nonetheless has to happen. I wanted to pick up on something you talked about, the role of women, and you've said climate change is a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution. Could you say more about the role of women and how that becomes a trim tab in defeating the climate crisis?
Yes, that line, a man-made problem that requires a feminist solution, is part of something else that I've done to try and communicate about climate change, which is something that I didn't even know 2 years ago what a podcast was, because I'm an elder, but I'm doing it now with a younger Irish woman, and it's funny, but it's also very serious. And I explain that man-made is generic. A feminist solution also includes as many men as possible. And the feminist solution is the solution we need, because it's the solution based on full equality, and full equality right across the board. When you look at climate justice, as I do, it includes issues of racial injustice, gender injustice, the sort of poverty injustice, poverty energy injustice, all of that. And so I think a justice lens is a very good one to look at climate change, and the children are reminding us of this. And what happened, I think, was until very recently, women leaders were preoccupied with a number of things, with Me Too issues, equal pay, violence against women, and then moving on to talking about health, even at the global level, or education, but not climate. I mean, they maybe reference climate, but not quite know how to talk about it. Since the report last October, women have really understood this is about our children and grandchildren. For goodness sake, wake up. And I find I'm involved with connected women, fearless women, lionesses, all of these very active verbs. And what we need to do is connect all these ways in which women are stepping up as never before. But it's important, very important, because many women are now presidents, prime ministers, ministers, and they will be more proactive to do something, I believe, than their male counterparts, unless the male counterparts are also feminists in their outlook.
I actually couldn't agree more as a feminist. And I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned another important sector, you said faith leaders. Yes. And I read a column, you might have seen it, a very fiery column of New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, who is talking about smoking and the tobacco companies hiding the reality of that cigarettes kill. And he said that's evil. But he said climate change isn't just killing people, it may kill civilization. Trying to confuse the public about that is evil at a whole different level. Don't some of these people have children? This word evil is it's a kind of a theological concept, and it's something that we also feel in our gut. You have, in your career, many times confronted what people might classify as evil, the evil of sectarian violence, for example, and religious violence. And you have managed to inculcate peace, even in the face of that. And I wonder if you could sort of transpose that to the climate crisis and to the sense of moral indignation that people are waking to, that again, I think Greta Thunberg has done a great deal to simply say, how dare you, and to awaken people's moral sense, which is kind of a religious spiritual function. How do we apply that and your lessons that you've learned to the climate crisis and confronting it robustly without...
Yeah,
yes.
I have actually, I think it was when I received a medal from Kew Gardens, and I also linked that with Wangari Maathai, because I made a speech after Wangari died, honoring her at Kew Gardens, but this was my turn, if you like. And I actually said that those who are deliberate deniers of climate for short-term profit are malign and even evil, because I believe that, if you're denying it deliberately. But I'm also ready to work with those to move forward the fossil fuel industry. I had an opportunity last June of being in the Vatican for the second convening by Pope Francis, who after all had a wonderful encyclical, Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home. And he had convened the previous year and it hadn't really worked out. So this was the second convening. More work had been done, including by Notre Dame, by scientists and academics in Notre Dame, to prepare a draft statement on putting a price on carbon, and a draft statement about carbon risk disclosure. And the heads of all the oil companies were there, including ExxonMobil, a whole lot, and the heads of investors in oil and gas were there. And some of us, John Schellenhuber, climate scientist, was there, I was there, etc. And they all signed up in the end to these rather weak statements, but the point was the signatures. For some reason, it hasn't had the impact that I thought it might, because there was a lot of tension in the room before they would sign. They were in consultation with their lawyers before they signed up, and then the statement was weak enough that they felt they could sign it. But the point is, we need to move, and I think Shell is the company that's most in front of the oil and gas companies to move in the right direction. And it's not so easy. You know, there needs to be some way of really encouraging, because if we can get the oil and gas companies to recognize they have to get out of oil and gas much quicker than they now think altogether, they can be on our side in devising the grid systems that can help with the clean energy, and we can move forward much more quickly.
And why do you see Shell as a bellwether and a beacon?
I just, that was the impression I had at the time, and since then, that they are moving more significantly to really be serious about their investments in renewable energy and trying to make that switch. But the problem is a simple one. You actually make billions from fossil fuel. You make millions from clean energy. So, you know, how do you come down from making billions to being content with making millions?
Yes, I mean, I've often been asked how would I define regeneration, which is kind of the banner that I'm trying to hold aloft these days. And I usually sum it up as give more, take less.
Yes.
That's the way that ecologies work and efficiencies that nature creates, and that's the way moral systems work. And it's usually not transposed into the business world.
But I think, you know, I've come to the conclusion that it's unlikely that the major players will actually move rather quickly unless they are disrupted. We need disruption of business as usual. And that disruption can take many, many forms. Litigation, and we're seeing more litigation. I think it can be quite effective. We're seeing shareholder action in companies. That can be effective. We're seeing the investors warning about climate risk. That can be effective. And we're seeing the disruption in the street, the children, their Fridays for Future, the marches. Imagine 6 million children having come out in the last couple of weeks at 2 different Fridays. And that's really impressive. And then Extinction Rebellion going a step further in peaceful protest.
Yes. And what would you recommend to those children in terms of building it? You know, it's an extraordinary moment, and these moments, as in sadly in Tahrir Square, we don't know what the outcome of Hong Kong will be, but it's been pointed out that the power of the social media driven movements is extraordinary, because you can mobilize lots of people. At the same time, you don't have the negotiations with leaders in the way the traditional movements were built, and sometimes there's just nowhere to go. So I'm wondering if you were to look at an ideal outcome of what is becoming a grassroots movement, because I absolutely agree with you. I think without the pressure from the grassroots, there's going to be a lot of dithering, and it's not going to happen in time. And yet I'm not clear what the mechanisms are going to be. And I wonder if you can see anything looking down the line a little bit, and having been around movements that have transformed nations and having catalyzed them and helped to guide them.
You know, I think that, you know, the children, I hope, will continue with their Fridays for Future, but, you know, they've taken more responsibility than they should have had to take as children, which was what Greta was pointing out in the Climate Action Summit. And I was there at the time, and I was in tears because I could see how unfair it was to children that they have to be the ones to be the conscience of the world. But I also...
This is right, I shouldn't hear.
Yeah. On the 18th of September, I attended the People's Summit in New York, which was a summit organized by my former office, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, with Amnesty International, Greenpeace, 350.org, some faith groups, about 400 organizations that had signed up to a declaration. And they're now developing a plan of action. And I think all the components need to somehow align in a loose way that can be done now with platforms on social media. I'm not quite sure, I'm an elder, how this will work out, but I see much, much more pressure over the coming years. And I actually see the possibility of alliances between civil society, business, investment, women leaders, you know, moving on particular countries, particular geographical areas, particular sectors, to try and get them to commit to the ambition that we need so that we have unusual alliances which could be much more effective.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And in fact, we are now working in Kenya, where we've been for 8 years, on what would a regenerative country look like, which will require a unity of all sectors, from civil society to business to government to faith, and especially looking at the role of, you talked about the islanders of Kiribati and the herders of Kenya specifically, and a Ugandan farmer who taught her neighbors to plant trees to stop topsoil erosion. This idea that the people supposedly at the bottom of the pyramid have enormous power. And I believe that actually our collective salvation is in part resting in the hands of the 600 million smallholder farmers who are marginalized, but in fact are drawing down carbon every day. But these are marginalized people. They're unnoticed by and large. And how do you see that becoming a leverage point in trying to resolve this crisis quickly?
This is very much why I wrote that book on climate justice. As you know, it's a book of 11 stories. 9 of them are about women, but there are also 2 good men. You mentioned Kiribati, and one of them is the former president of Kiribati, Anote Tong. He went to Copenhagen and realized that his country had no future. His small atolls had no future because they hadn't agreed to the 1.5. And he went back in some despair to face his people. And then he bought land in Fiji so that when the sea level rose to the degree it was going to, he could have his people migrate with dignity. And then he decided to fight back and to be part of the pressure for 1.5, and he was very much involved in Paris, etc. And he's trying now to raise the small atolls by some engineering so that his people will be able to stay where they are as a sovereign people and not be just a group of people with no sovereignty in some part of Fiji, which is what they might be consigned to at the moment. And I actually identify with that story because I've been president of my country, but I didn't have to go to a conference and come back and tell my people the Irish have no future. You know, you really have to kind of feel that empathy. And I think what I was trying to do in the book, it's all about indigenous peoples. It's about Hindu in Lake Chad area, a young indigenous woman who became chair of the Indigenous Peoples Forum at the climate conference. It's about 2 stories in the United States. One of them is about Sharon Henshaw, who lived in East Biloxi and was very affected by Hurricane Katrina. She was on the wrong side of the tracks, as she said, African American, so the race issue comes in. But she had her salon and her home there in East Biloxi, both of them destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. She was humiliated by the abject poverty she was in, but she found her way of fighting back, of becoming an accidental activist, as she said, and getting women to plant trees, to grow things, to work together, etc. And the other story in the United States is in Alaska, Patricia Cochran, who's a native Alaskan scientist. And she has been watching the erosion of her state, basically, of the coastal areas, the sea coming in, and villages that have to move. And even in the United States, there's no money. There's no planning for moving villages because of the seawater incursion. And you know, I chose those particularly in the United States to show that even in major economies now, on the outskirts, on the edges, it's happening. It was the edge of Europe, a story of the Sami people in northern Sweden that I used for Europe. We have to somehow have more empathy and understanding that those who are most affected also have local wisdom, local traditional knowledge, which we need, especially, as you say, small farmers and indigenous people saving our forests. We can learn from all of that.
Yes, I mean, we found that again in Kenya. We've been doing projects to restore the indigenous kaya forests, which are sacred groves. And of course, they're also biodiversity hotspots because the indigenous sense of the sacred has preserved the biodiversity because it's sacred and you can't just cut down the trees and hunt the animals. And these have become places of peacemaking. And we're trying to create youth elder programs and have where the traditional knowledge is conveyed to the youth from the elders, and the youth help the elders to build out these sacred forests and with their biodiversity. So in a lot of, I think, small ways, this knowledge is coming to light, but really, I think you're right in a much larger sense that the biocultural knowledge to save the planet actually rests with the indigenous people. And I think they've faced a lot of obstacles, even from environmentalists who feel that, oh, they shouldn't be in the forests, they might cut down the tree, and so I wonder if you see other ways to sort of encourage, to sort of reverse the what's on bottom and what's on top, in a way, that here are the marginalized people who actually maybe have the solutions more than we do.
Yeah. Well, Indigenous peoples have certainly been fighting very hard with the Indigenous Peoples Forum in the climate talks, and it took a long time to get a real recognition, but now there is recognition of the importance of local and traditional knowledge, and also the importance of the voice of women in relation to that, grassroots women. You know, I have to confess that, you know, when I came to climate change, it was through the lens of human rights. It was working in African countries on the rights that matter if you don't have them, rights to food, water, health, education. I was made aware that things were so much worse because they were unpredictable, etc. But I was still talking about human rights and gender equality. More recently, I have really understood holistically the importance of the indigenous wisdom, of being very close to nature, of knowing that we're linked with the ecosystems, with the animals, etc. And this was brought home to me when I was I was invited in August to be, first of all, in Iceland for a funeral, basically, for an extinct glacier. You probably heard about it because it was quite widely talked about. There was a memorial by a poet, and it was a beautiful 3 lines which said, "We know what to do, only you will know if we have done it." It was a message to the future. And we made speeches at the foot of the extinct iceberg, and then this was placed at the top. And that was very sad. And about 10 days later, I was going to a long-planned scientific expedition to Greenland. And I sat at the foot of a glacier, which was calving with a thunderous sound. But it was clear to me that there was too much tension in the calving. You could tell nature was straining and calving too much. It was hot sun. I mean, there were about 14 degrees sunshine, blue sky, as I was sitting there. And it was kind of, I really felt, you know, a kind of an empathy for Mother Nature of what we're doing to her in a very physical way that I hadn't until very recently. And I now understand that I was a bit deficient in only talking about human rights and gender equality and people. And I should have been more aware that we have to really see this in a very holistic way.
Yes, I think it was Einstein who said that we suffer from an optical delusion of consciousness, where we have, I'm going to paraphrase, but we have a great deal of compassion and love for those nearest us. And we need to expand that same sense to encompass all of humanity and the whole of nature, I think was the way he put it, to exercise this.
And in fairness, Pope Francis in Laudato Si takes that approach. He was the first one to encourage me to start thinking along those lines.
Yes, it's one of the great holistic and regenerative documents. So getting back to this idea of faith as potentially taking the lead in the sort of the moral, but also practical dimensions of this crisis. You know, there's been something like $6 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, that's been divested from fossil fuel stocks. And faith communities are a part of that. But I've noticed that a lot of that money is going into screened investments, for example, maybe renewables, not much into the sort of moral sphere where you put the carbon in the air through your investment. Shouldn't your investments now draw it down? Shouldn't it go to, again, these forgotten smallholder farmers, et cetera, on the front line, the indigenous people who are on the front lines of climate change? Do you see a greater role, perhaps, for the faith communities and for the, in a way, almost universal thread of eco-spirituality that you can find at the core of every religion. Every religion has a great tree somewhere at the center of it.
Yes, I think it's really important that faith communities that tend to be much closer to people than, for example, politicians in communities, that they do take on a real leadership on this issue. I think it's beginning, but it's by no means there. I think the divestment has been really important, but I'm aware that very little of climate finance goes to those on the ground who are working in a regenerative way, who are working in a saving the forests way with indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge, etc. It's just amazing. I've been part of trying to get a circle of philanthropy on climate justice, because climate justice means you support those who are working on the ground to address their own problems, but also have a wisdom for the rest of us.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
and that is beginning to happen, but it's far too slow still. I think we need to see much more real discussion in each country. It's partly education. I mean, we have some green schools in Ireland who educate their parents, but the whole education system isn't changing as it should be, because we need to implement the 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a matter of total priority for Ireland as one country. And so we need to see every country now take a kind of ownership. I mean, I'm very interested in what you're talking about in Kenya. A regenerative country. That's possible. It's possible.
It is possible.
It's very interesting. On our podcast, after the scientists had issued their report last October last year, we wanted a scientist to come on our show with our humor and our seriousness. And we wanted a scientist from the South. And we got a woman scientist from Botswana, Pauline Bue, Duve. And she was very good at explaining the impact of that report on 1.5 degrees of warming. And then she started to talk in a very personal way about her empathy for developed countries. And I'd never heard anybody say this before. She said, I have such empathy for developed countries because they're going to have such difficulty. They have huge grids. They have so many workers now in the wrong way of going, fossil fuel. I have such empathy with the difficulty they're going to have with a transition, which is going to have to be fair. I have such empathy. She must have said it about 5 times. And it really is something that she's absolutely right. We have not begun the just transition, the scaling up of funding. Some countries are beginning. Spain recently put up a large amount of money to get out of coal and to do it with the trade unions, and they're making progress. But Germany is very slow, should be doing far more, etc. The United States, very tragic that coal mines are collapsing and workers are just being left. It's really very sad.
Yes, and also I think there is a little more acuity in the thinking about this transition that has to be made in the developed countries. I read an article recently that pointed out that the massive infrastructure changes of something like the Green New Deal are not have pain points in terms of carbon, because these are construction projects and they're going to emit carbon before they draw it down. And we have to look at this really carefully because again, we tend to take our eye off the ball when we look at 5 billion acres of degraded land in the developing world that actually in a drawdown context could be an asset. And there is, as you say, very little capital flowing in that direction. It seems to be kind of bottled up. So I would ask you, because I think this is a unique opportunity to ask somebody who's not only been a moral actor, but a head of state, what would you do? Were you were you running the world, or literally pragmatically, how could you see the capital because flowing in the direction it needs to flow? Because frankly, as somebody who is active also in this arena, I think that's the brick wall very often. It's the risk aversion of impact investors, of all of the actors who are still thinking more about building, preserving capital and preserving the earth, and growing capital and growing trees. There aren't, what I'm saying, I guess, is the economic mechanisms for a regenerative economy. Do you see any green shoots in that department?
Well, certainly, the elders are very concerned about climate change as one of two existential threats. The other one we're also concerned about is nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, and we're not going in the right direction there either. But just back to climate change, we actually are seeking to influence investment communities. We have an access and we have a moral voice. We're trying to use that moral voice very deliberately. And I attend quite a few conferences now of clean energy, but also investing with other elders to try, with Ban Ki-moon in particular, to try to influence the fact that they need to be warning about stranded assets, need to be doing more of what Mark Carney and some others are doing. And we also need the disruption of the business as usual through the many ways that I mentioned of litigation or shareholder pressure or whatever, in order to get movement there. We need all of this. We need the pressure of the civil society, broad coalition that we've been talking about, pressing in different countries and different regions for more political activity. I mean, what was notable at the Climate Action Summit was the lack of commitment of the G20 countries. Now, the United States is not helpful in this regard with President Trump. I know that there are states and cities and business in the United States which is trying to compensate almost, which is very active in the right direction. But it was notable that countries did not commit at the Climate Action Summit in the way that might have been hoped. It was hoped that China might commit, but then the trade war has messed that up a bit. And with the United States not committing, why should China go out of its way? Hopefully they will commit in 2020 under the Paris Climate Agreement in their own country commitment.
Yeah, I've noticed that Ireland has made a tremendous commitment to tree planting, and we're beginning to see very large commitments. Ethiopia planted 300 million trees. I've actually worked there and maybe made a small contribution to that. And so it's very gratifying.
I was actually amazed. Yeah, the elders were in Addis for our, we meet twice a year, and we met in Addis Ababa earlier this year in May, and we met with Prime Minister Abiy, and he told us they were going to plant a huge number of trees. And I was amazed that in one summer, they planted over 300,000. I mean, that was significant. 300
million.
300,000, yes, yeah.
Wait, no, 300 million.
300 million, I'm sorry.
300 million, yeah. I think it was in one day.
I knew I was wrong on the 300 million, yeah, yeah.
Shows what's possible, yes. Do you think that your country, Ireland, having made this commitment, I can't remember precisely the number, I think it was maybe something like a...
Well, there is a realization that we also have to commit, because we, if you look at Ireland, was very forested in the past, and we've lost our forests to a large extent, so we need to... and I'm very in favor of the drawdown approaches and how this is done, the regeneration, the way in which we can use lots of ways. And it's interesting in the drawdown approach that of their, I think it's about 10 priorities, 2 of them are very interesting. Educate girls and women and have access to reproductive health and family planning. And in developing countries, that could make a huge difference, because countries are having their development undermined by 2 things, by climate change and by fast population, which they can't actually cope with, can't plan for. So if women had access to contraceptive means, we know that about 200 million women want to space their children and can't get access to the means to do it, mainly in Africa and India, for example, and South Asia. So, it's great to think that two things that are very good for people would also be very good for the climate.
Yes, and I think there's been a lot of statistics about the education of women and girls, empowerment of women seems to, and economic empowerment of women in the developing world seems to lower the birth rate in any case, because there's a direct relationship to empowering women.
Absolutely. And that's why the fact that women leaders are now stepping up. I mean, they were already stepping up in Africa. I mean, because the climate is so integral to survival, to any kind of productivity, anything. It's so affected by severe drought, by the cyclone that hit Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi recently, and leveled a whole city of 3 million people in Mozambique. You know, imagine, you know, trying to cope with that in the developed parts of the world. And, we are seeing more hurricanes, more cyclones that are because of the warming water, because they're exacerbated by climate.
Yes, more thermal energy in the system. I wanted to ask you, just to flip the script for a minute, in your absolutely wonderful book, Climate Justice, which I would recommend anybody to read, you talk about an incident, it was really surprising. It was in 1847, the Choctaw people of Oklahoma raised $173, which was a lot in those days, for famine victims in Ireland. Why did you include this in a book about climate justice? It's really sort of counterintuitive.
Because we need a sense of empathy and solidarity for each other. And what the Choctaw people did was, you know, they were meeting in distress themselves. They'd been moved from their tribal land 10 years earlier, and they were memorializing that. And they heard about a tribe on an island far away where the stable crop had failed for the third year. And that they understood, and therefore they raised the money and sent it. There was no connection otherwise. We need a much more feeling of solidarity and empathy if we're going to implement the 2030 agenda, which we've committed to doing, with its leave no one behind, and even prioritize the furthest behind first. That's a sentence I never heard before in an international commitment. Prioritize the furthest behind first. If we did that, we would help a lot, because we would get to those who don't switch the switch for electricity. About 1 billion people of our world are currently of about 7.7 or 7.8 billion. So it's a big proportion. And an even bigger proportion, 2.3 billion, still cook on dirty cook stoves and inhale indoor smoke and die in millions. We have the clean cook stoves, we have the mini gadgets, we have the solar panels, we have the off-grid possibilities. We haven't had the moonshot approach that we need to doing it. I'm hearing that Rockefeller and Gates Foundation are beginning to talk about a real moonshot, addressing that issue of getting clean energy to the very poorest so they can take themselves out of dire poverty.
Yes, I'm of the school that actually the developing world can leapfrog in the same way that they didn't ever go to landline telephones, could leapfrog into small-scale solar networks and the like, and even alternative economic systems in a place like Kenya, where you have the M-Pesa system. Everybody's banking on cell phone.
Yes, I think
we have actually tried complementary currencies there because I think we need sort of some radical experiments. I wanted to ask you also about a wonderful case in your book. You mentioned a woman in Constance Okolit, a Ugandan farmer who taught her neighbors to plant trees to stop topsoil erosion. I wanted to stress this point in your book that you're looking at, in a sense, how everybody can be what might be called the Axismundi, you know, that everybody is a moral center. If you sort of plant your roots and in the old civil rights song, like a tree standing by the water, you will not be moved. You will speak your truth, as Greta Thunberg did, sitting in front of the Swedish parliament all along with a sign and demonstrated this. So I wonder, you know, in the instance of Constance Okolit, how one person actually was a catalyst by beginning small.
Oh, Constance is a very interesting woman. We've become very good friends. She's tall and dignified, and she has a presence that's quite compelling. I've noticed it over the years. When she started, she thought God was punishing her and her village when it was destroyed. And then she learned through Oxfam about climate change. And then she thought, oh, it's not God, it's the lives of rich people. And will they come and help us? And then she realized they won't. So we have to help ourselves. And now she's become an important voice in climate summits. She's based in Uganda, and the Irish delegation include her as a full delegate in climate conferences. So she's at the table and she makes her voice heard, and she describes it as a kind of a ripple of water somehow. She has a lovely way of describing it in the book. You know, when I hear her voice at climate summits, which I do more and more, it gives me such joy that she's there. She's a mover and a shaker. She's influencing, she's telling her story, and it's very, very compelling. And, you know, it really is, it's important. And the voices that we've been able to bring to the table of grassroots, of indigenous, mainly women, and some young women at that, really make a difference. Because the delegates at these climate conferences live in cities, are largely men, and are technical, and worry about the commas and the this and the that, and don't feel for the crisis in people's lives until they hear the direct word. And then it makes a difference. I've actually seen it. It sharpens them up. They're ready to agree to something that they might not be ready to agree to before that. And it's really very necessary. And that's why I think women's leadership really coming in on this will make a difference. I'm confident of that.
I'll mention that we are planning what amounts to an alternative or regenerative Davos next year in June. And we hope to have a lot of those voices at the table. And I dare say yours, if you're interested, talk about that another time. But speaking of which, I thought we have about how much do we have, Kate, left? 4 minutes that we've been, I could talk to you for 10 hours, but I think, Kate, you had said that there were people would be also having questions for Mary that from the audience. Am I correct?
Well, I think that the audience has been enraptured with your dialogue, and there have not been any questions, because I think you proposed some really good ones and provoked some great dialogue. So thank you so much, both of you, for being here with us this morning, or this day, if you're in Ireland. And so I think we need to wrap it up. And I just want to, again, thank you so much for your time and this wonderful conversation. And I want to encourage everyone to donate to the Charter for Compassion so that we can keep programs like this coming. Thank you, Mary, for your contribution to the world. We're talking today about your amazing book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and Fight for a Sustainable Future.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Mark, for a very good conversation. I enjoyed it, and I'm certainly willing to consider June if you
thank you
if you send me an invitation.
I would love to pursue this further. There are a lot of touch points.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.